The dawn light had barely crept over the Nebraska plains when Adelaide Donovan pushed through the doors of the Silver Spur Saloon, her eyes already burning from lack of sleep, knowing she had exactly 14 hours of work ahead of her before she could collapse into bed again. She moved through the empty saloon with practiced efficiency, her dark hair still damp from the quick wash she had managed at the boarding house. The chairs needed to be pulled down from the tables, the floors swept clean of yesterday's dust and tobacco, and the bar polished before the first customers wandered in around noon. Her hands moved automatically, muscle memory guiding her through tasks she could perform half asleep. At 24 years old, Adelaide had become an expert at functioning on exhaustion. The saloon work was her first job of the day, starting at 5 in the morning and running until noon. Then she would rush across Fort Kearny's Main Street to the general store where Mr. Patterson employed her from noon until 6 in the evening, stocking shelves, managing inventory, and serving customers. After that, she would spend her evenings at the boarding house, cooking and cleaning for Mrs. Henderson until 9 or 10 at night, sometimes later if there were extra guests. 3 jobs, 7 days a week. It had been this way for 8 months now, ever since Thomas had died. Adelaide paused in her sweeping, her grip tightening on the broom handle as she forced away the memory. Thomas Donovan had been a good man, a kind husband, but he had also been a terrible gambler and an even worse businessman. When the fever took him last winter, she had discovered the truth. Everything they owned, including their small house on the edge of town, belonged to the bank. Thomas had borrowed against it, borrowed against everything, chasing one failed venture after another. She had been left with nothing but debts, and the widow's weeds she wore for exactly 2 weeks before realizing that grief was a luxury she could not afford. The sound of boots on the wooden sidewalk outside made her look up. It was too early for customers. She continued sweeping, but her attention drifted to the door. Arthur Nolan pushed through the saloon doors, dust covering his clothes from what must have been a long ride. He was a tall man, probably in his late 20s, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a winter sky. Adelaide had seen him around Fort Kearny a few times over the past month, always alone, always quiet. He worked as a ranch hand for the Morrisons spread about 10 miles north of town, or so she had heard from the gossip that flowed freely in the saloon. "We're not open yet," Adelaide said, not unkindly. "Another couple of hours." Arthur removed his hat, revealing hair that was somewhere between brown and blonde, lightened by hours in the sun. "I know, madam, I'm not here for a drink." He hesitated, turning his hat in his hands. "I'm here about you." Adelaide's spine straightened. She had dealt with unwanted attention before, men who thought a widow was desperate or easy. Her hand shifted on the broom handle, ready to use it as a weapon if needed. "Then you can leave." "No, madam, I think you misunderstand." Arthur took a step back, his hands raised slightly. "I'm not here to bother you. I'm here to offer you a way out." "A way out of what?" "This." He gestured around the empty saloon. "Working yourself to death. I've been watching you, madam, and I don't mean that in any improper way. But I've seen you running from one job to the next, barely stopping to breathe. It's not right." Adelaide's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Not right, maybe not, but it's necessary. I have debts to pay. My late husband saw to that." "I know about the debts," Arthur said quietly. "I've made inquiries. You owe the bank $400. You owe another $100 to various merchants in town. At the rate you're going, working 3 jobs, you might have it paid off in 2 years. If you don't collapse first." Heat rushed to Adelaide's cheeks, part anger and part humiliation. "You had no right to pry into my affairs." "You're right, I didn't. But I did anyway because I needed to know the situation before I made my offer." What offer? Adelaide demanded, though suspicion coiled in her stomach. Nothing came without a price, she had learned that much. Arthur met her eyes steadily. Marry me. I'll pay off your debts, all of them, and your only job will be being loved. The silence that followed his words seemed to stretch impossibly long. Adelaide stared at him, waiting for the punchline, the cruel twist, the real demand that always followed such seemingly generous offers. You're insane, she finally said. Maybe, Arthur agreed, but I'm also serious. You don't even know me. I know enough. I know you're strong and hardworking. I know you're honest because you're killing yourself to pay off debts that weren't even your making. I know you're brave because you get up every morning and face another impossible day without complaining. He took a breath. And I know you're beautiful, though I suspect you haven't had time to think about that in months. Adelaide's hand went unconsciously to her hair, scraped back in a simple bun, then dropped. This is ridiculous. People don't just marry strangers. They do all the time out here, Arthur countered. Mail-order brides, arranged marriages, marriages of convenience. This would be different from those, though. I'm not looking for a housekeeper or a cook or someone to warm my bed out of obligation. His voice softened. I'm lonely, madam. I've been lonely for a long time. I left Tennessee 3 years ago after my family died from cholera. I've been drifting ever since, working ranch to ranch, never staying anywhere long enough to matter. But I'm tired of it. I want a home. I want someone to care about, someone who might eventually care about me. I've got money saved, enough to pay your debts and buy us a proper house. I just need someone to share it with. Adelaide lowered herself slowly onto one of the chairs she had just pulled down. Her legs felt unsteady. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Arthur moved closer but maintained a respectful distance. I'm not asking you to love me right away. I know that takes time. But I'm asking you to give us a chance. Let me take care of the debts. Let me take care of you. And maybe, over time, we could build something real together. I can't just quit my jobs and marry a stranger. Why not? What's keeping you here? The crushing weight of work that's stealing your life day by day. His voice was gentle but firm. You're existing, Adelaide, not living. When's the last time you did something just because it made you happy? When's the last time you watched a sunset or read a book, or just sat still without worrying about which job you needed to run to next? The use of her first name startled her, though she supposed everyone in town knew who she was. The poor widow working herself to the bone. She hated being pitied, but she hated even more that he was right. She could not remember the last time she had felt anything other than tired. This is insane, she repeated, but her voice held less conviction. Give me a month, Arthur said. Marry me. Let me pay the debts and give me 1 month to prove that this could work. If at the end of that time you're miserable, I'll arrange a divorce. I'll buy you a house of your own, free and clear, and you can live however you want. No obligations. Divorce is scandalous. So is working yourself to death, but here we are. Adelaide closed her eyes. Every rational part of her brain screamed that this was foolish, dangerous, impossible. But there was a small, exhausted voice underneath all of that which whispered a single word. Yes. Why me? She asked, opening her eyes. There are plenty of women in Fort Kearney. Why choose the one with all the debts and problems? Arthur smiled, and it transformed his entire face. Because when I see you, I don't see problems. I see strength. I see resilience. I see someone who knows how to fight for what matters. Those are the qualities I want in a partner. He paused. And because every time I've seen you smile at a customer or help someone at the general store, even when you're dead on your feet, there's a kindness in you that hasn't been crushed by everything you've been through. That's rare. That's precious. Adelaide felt something crack inside her chest, some protective wall she had built up. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. 1 month, she heard herself say, but I have conditions. Name them. You said you're not expecting me to warm your bed out of obligation. I need that to be clear. We marry, but we don't. We're not. She felt her face heating. Separate rooms, Arthur said immediately. I mean what I said. This is a chance for us to build something real, not a transaction. Anything physical happens only if and when you want it to, and not before. And the divorce, if I want it. You promise? You have my word. If after 1 month you want out, I'll make it happen, and I'll make sure you're taken care of. Adelaide stood up, her decision made before her mind fully caught up with her mouth. Then yes, I'll marry you, Arthur Nolan. The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise, and for the first time in 8 months, Adelaide felt something other than despair. It might have been hope, or it might have been terror. She could not quite tell the difference. The practical arrangements happened faster than Adelaide had thought possible. Arthur went directly to the bank when it opened and paid off her mortgage debt in full. The banker, Mr. Stevens, could barely hide his surprise when Arthur counted out $400 in cash without blinking. Then Arthur made his way to each merchant she owed, settling those accounts as well. By noon, Adelaide Donovan was debt-free for the first time since before her husband had died. She informed her employers of her immediate resignation. The saloon owner merely grunted and told her he would have someone else in by tomorrow. Mr. Patterson at the general store seemed genuinely sorry to see her go and wished her well. Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house clutched Adelaide's hands and told her she had been praying for something exactly like this to happen. That young man has good eyes, Mrs. Henderson said. Honest eyes. You'll be all right, dear. Adelaide hoped she was right. The wedding took place that very afternoon at the small church on the edge of Fort Kearney. The preacher, Reverend Matthews, seemed bemused by the rush but performed the ceremony without complaint. Mrs. Henderson stood as Adelaide's witness, and Arthur brought one of his fellow ranch hands, a quiet man named Billy, to stand for him. Adelaide wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that had seen better days but was at least clean and pressed. Arthur had somehow found time to bathe and change into what must have been his only good shirt. They stood before the Reverend and spoke vows that felt both surreal and binding. When Arthur slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, Adelaide's hand trembled. This was real. She had just married a man she had spoken to for perhaps an hour total. The magnitude of what she had done crashed over her, and for a moment, she thought she might faint. Then Arthur squeezed her hand gently, and when she looked up at him, his expression was so openly hopeful and kind that her panic subsided to a manageable level. You may kiss your bride, Reverend Matthews announced. Arthur leaned down and pressed the gentlest, most chaste kiss to her lips. It was over in a second, but Adelaide felt it like a brand. After the ceremony, Arthur led her to a small house on the eastern edge of town. It was modest but well built, with 2 bedrooms, a main living area, and a kitchen. I bought it this morning, Arthur explained as he opened the door. The previous owner moved back east. It needs some work, but it's sound, and it's ours. Adelaide walked through the space in a daze. There was furniture, basic but functional. The kitchen had a good stove. The bedrooms each had a bed with a real mattress. After months of sleeping on a borrowed cot in the corner of Mrs. Henderson's storage room, it looked like luxury. I'll take the smaller room, Arthur said, pointing to the bedroom on the left. You take the main one, it's got better light. Arthur. Adelaide turned to face him. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. He set his hat on a hook by the door. Are you hungry? I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage eggs and bacon. Adelaide realized she had not eaten since yesterday evening. "I'm starving." They moved to the kitchen together, and for the first time since she had woken up that morning, Adelaide felt herself relax a fraction. Arthur was true to his word about his cooking skills. The eggs were slightly overdone and the bacon was unevenly crispy, but it was food and it was warm, and Adelaide ate every bite. "Tell me about Tennessee," Adelaide said as they ate at the small kitchen table. "You said your family died." Arthur's expression grew somber. "Cholera swept through in the spring of 1873. Took my parents, my 2 sisters, and my younger brother within a week. I was out on a cattle drive when it happened. By the time I got back." He trailed off, his fork still in his hand. "There was nothing left to stay for. The farm was going to auction for back taxes, so I headed west and just kept moving." "I'm sorry," Adelaide said softly. "That's a terrible thing to survive." "What about you?" Arthur asked. "You said your husband passed last winter." Adelaide nodded, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. "Thomas was a dreamer, always chasing the next big opportunity, the next sure thing. He meant well, but he had no head for business. When he died, I found out he had borrowed against everything we owned and then some. The bank was ready to foreclose. I managed to negotiate a repayment plan, but it meant—" She shrugged. "Well, you saw what it meant. You must have loved him very much to work so hard to preserve his honor." "I don't know," Adelaide said honestly. "Maybe I did at first, but by the end I was mostly just tired. Tired of the schemes, tired of the worry, tired of pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't." She looked up at Arthur. "Does that make me a terrible person?" "It makes you human," Arthur said. "Love isn't always enough when there's no respect to go with it." They sat in companionable silence for a moment. Then Adelaide stood to clear the dishes. Arthur moved to help, and they washed and dried together, establishing a rhythm without discussion. When the kitchen was clean, an awkward moment descended. It was early evening, the sun just beginning its descent toward the horizon. Adelaide realized she had no idea what came next. "I should tend to my horse," Arthur said, seeming to sense her uncertainty. "Get him settled in the small barn out back. Why don't you take some time to get yourself situated? Unpack, rest, whatever you need. There's no expectations here, Adelaide. This is your home now. You can do whatever you want." After he left, Adelaide stood in the middle of the small house and felt tears prick her eyes. When was the last time someone had told her to rest? To do what she wanted? She could not remember. She explored the house more thoroughly, finding that Arthur had stocked the kitchen with basic supplies. The bedroom he had designated as hers had a wardrobe, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, and a window that overlooked a small garden plot. The bed was made with clean linens. Adelaide sat on the edge of the bed and let herself cry. She cried for Thomas, for the life she had thought she would have, for the exhausting months that had followed his death. She cried from relief and fear and confusion. And then, when she had no more tears left, she washed her face, unpacked the few belongings she had brought with her, and lay down on the bed. She meant to rest for just a moment, but exhaustion claimed her, and she fell into a sleep so deep that she did not even dream. When Adelaide woke, the room was dark and she was disoriented. For a moment she could not remember where she was. Then it came back. The hurried wedding, the new house, Arthur. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding. What time was it? How long had she slept? She fumbled for the matches on the bedside table and lit the oil lamp. The watch that had been Thomas's, which she had kept, told her it was just past 5 in the morning. She had slept for almost 12 hours. Adelaide stood up, straightening her dress, and opened her bedroom door. The house was quiet. She moved to the kitchen and found a pot of coffee still warm on the stove and a covered plate with bread and jam. A note in careful handwriting sat beside it. Didn't want to wake you. Had to head to the Morrison Ranch for work. Should be back by evening. Make yourself at home. Arthur. Adelaide ate the simple breakfast and sipped the coffee, marveling at the strangeness of her new life. Yesterday morning she had woken before dawn to sweep floors at the saloon. This morning she had woken in a real bed, in a real house, with nothing she had to do. The freedom was almost paralyzing. She spent the morning exploring Fort Kearny properly for the first time in months. When she had been working 3 jobs, she had moved through town with blinders on, focused only on getting from one obligation to the next. Now she could actually look around, notice things. The town had grown since she had last paid attention. There were new shops, new houses being built on the outskirts. Fort Kearny sat along the Platte River in Nebraska, and it had started as an actual military fort back in the 40s before the town grew up around it. The military presence had mostly moved on, but the town remained, a waypoint for travelers and a trading center for the surrounding ranches and farms. Adelaide found herself at the general store, not to work but to shop. She had a small amount of money that Arthur had given her that morning, telling her to buy whatever she needed or wanted. The concept of buying something she wanted rather than needed was foreign. Mr. Patterson greeted her warmly. "Mrs. Nolan, good to see you. How are you settling in?" The new name still sounded strange to her ears. "Well, thank you. I'm just looking around." She bought fabric for curtains, some vegetables for dinner, and on impulse, a book. She had always loved reading, but there had been no time for it in recent months. The book was a collection of poetry, and she clutched it like treasure as she walked home. Home. The word felt both too big and too small for what the little house represented. She spent the afternoon making curtains, her fingers remembering the skill her mother had taught her years ago. As she sewed, she felt some of the constant tension she had carried for months begin to ease from her shoulders. When Arthur returned that evening, dusty and tired from a day of ranch work, Adelaide had dinner ready. It was simple, just stew and biscuits, but she had taken her time with it, making it properly instead of throwing something together in stolen minutes. "This smells amazing," Arthur said as he washed up at the basin. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "It wasn't trouble," Adelaide said, and realized she meant it. It was nice, actually, cooking without rushing. They ate together, and Adelaide found herself asking about his day. Arthur told her about the cattle they were moving to new pasture, about the ornery bull that had nearly taken out a fence, about the other ranch hands and their various quirks. His words painted pictures, and Adelaide found herself genuinely interested. "What about you?" Arthur asked. "How was your first full day as a lady of leisure?" Adelaide laughed. "I'm hardly a lady of leisure, but it was strange. Good strange, but strange. I made curtains." She gestured to the windows where her handiwork now hung. "And I bought a book." "Yeah, what kind of book?" "Poetry." She felt suddenly self-conscious. "I used to love reading poetry before life got in the way," Arthur finished. "I'd like to hear some if you're willing to read aloud sometime." Adelaide blinked. Thomas had always thought poetry was frivolous, a waste of time. "You would, sure." "I'm not much of a reader myself, never had much schooling, but I like the sound of pretty words." They fell into a pattern over the following days. Arthur would leave for the ranch early each morning, and Adelaide would have the day to herself. At first, she hardly knew what to do with the time. She would clean the house top to bottom, but it was so small that it only took a couple of hours. She cooked, but that too required only a fraction of the time she had available. Slowly, she began to remember what it was like to have interests beyond survival. She read her poetry book, then bought another. She planted vegetables in the garden plot. She visited with Mrs. Henderson, not as an employee but as a friend. She wrote a long overdue letter to her sister in Ohio, telling her about the surprising turn her life had taken. And every evening, Arthur would come home and they would eat dinner together and talk. They talked about everything: their childhoods, their dreams, their fears, their opinions on everything from politics to whether dogs made better pets than cats. Adelaide found herself looking forward to those evenings more than she wanted to admit. Arthur was easy to talk to, thoughtful in his responses, genuinely interested in what she had to say. He made her laugh with his dry observations about the ranch hands. He listened when she talked about her worries, her lingering grief, her uncertainty about the future. 1 week became 2. 2 weeks became 3. "The month is almost up," Arthur said one evening as they sat on the small porch, watching the sun set over the Nebraska plains. His voice was carefully neutral. Adelaide felt her stomach clench. She had been trying not to think about the deadline. "I know." "Have you thought about what you want to do?" She turned to look at him. In the golden light of the setting sun, his face was open, vulnerable. She realized that she would hurt him if she left, and the thought caused her actual pain. "I don't want a divorce," she said quietly. The relief that washed over Arthur's features was almost palpable. "No, no," Adelaide took a breath. "I know we married as strangers, but I don't feel like we're strangers anymore. You've been nothing but kind and patient and respectful. You've given me back my life. And somewhere in the past few weeks, I've started to care about you, really care about you." Arthur reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle. "I care about you too, more than I thought possible in such a short time." They sat there as the sun finished its descent, hands linked, and Adelaide felt something shift between them. The foundation they had been building was solidifying into something real. That night, Adelaide lay in her bed and thought about the wall between their 2 rooms. She thought about Arthur's kindness, his patience, the way he looked at her like she was precious. She thought about how her heart had started to beat faster when she heard his footsteps on the porch each evening. She was falling in love with her husband. The realization should have terrified her, but instead, it felt like coming home. The next morning, Adelaide woke with a new sense of purpose. She had made the decision to stay, but she wanted this marriage to be more than just convenient. She wanted it to be real in every sense. She made breakfast with extra care, and when Arthur came to the kitchen, she poured his coffee and then impulsively kissed his cheek. Arthur froze, his eyes wide. "Adelaide, is that all right?" she asked, suddenly uncertain. "It's more than all right," he said softly. "It's wonderful." They began to court each other, an odd thing to do after you were already married, but it felt right. Arthur would bring her wildflowers he found on the range. Adelaide would pack special lunches for him to take to work. They would take walks in the evening, his arm eventually finding its way around her waist, her head eventually finding its way to his shoulder. One evening, about 6 weeks after their wedding, they were sitting on the porch when Arthur turned to her with unusual seriousness. "Adelaide, I need to tell you something." Her heart clenched. "What is it?" "I've been offered a permanent position at the Morrison Ranch, not just as a hand but as a foreman. It's good money, steady work. But it would mean longer hours sometimes, more responsibility." He paused. "I wanted to know how you felt about it before I gave an answer." Adelaide felt warmth spread through her chest. He was asking her opinion, treating her as a true partner. "How do you feel about it?" "I want to take it," Arthur admitted. "I'm tired of drifting. I want to put down roots here, build a real life, but only if you're happy with that." "I'm happy with it," Adelaide said. "I'm happy with you." Arthur's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and kissed her. It was different from the chaste kiss at their wedding. This was deeper, full of promise and building desire. When they pulled apart, Adelaide was breathless. "Arthur, too much?" he asked, concern in his eyes. "Not enough," she whispered. They moved slowly, carefully, both aware of the significance of what was happening. Arthur stood and offered his hand. Adelaide took it and let him lead her inside. At the door to her bedroom, she paused. "I'm nervous," she admitted. "We don't have to do anything you're not ready for," Arthur said immediately. "I'm ready," Adelaide said. "I'm just nervous." Thomas, he wasn't. He was never particularly interested in whether I enjoyed. She trailed off, embarrassed. Understanding and anger flashed across Arthur's face. "I'm not Thomas. Your pleasure matters to me, Adelaide. It matters a great deal." She believed him. She pulled him into her room, and they discovered each other with tenderness and growing passion. Arthur was patient and attentive, and when Adelaide cried out in pleasure, genuinely for the first time in her life, his expression was one of pure joy. Afterward, they lay tangled together in her bed, and Adelaide felt a completeness she had never experienced before. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. Arthur's arms tightened around her. "I love you too. I think I have since the first time I saw you pushing through those saloon doors, determined to face another impossible day. Why didn't you say something sooner? I wanted you to have time. To choose us without pressure." He kissed her forehead. "I would have waited as long as you needed." Adelaide burrowed closer to him. "I don't want separate rooms anymore. Music to my ears," Arthur murmured. Life settled into a new rhythm, one built on genuine partnership and growing love. Arthur took the foreman position at the Morrison Ranch, and while the hours were sometimes long, he always came home to Adelaide. They would eat dinner together, talk about their days, and retire to their shared bed where they continued to discover the depths of their passion for each other. Adelaide found herself becoming part of the Fort Kearny community in a way she never had before. When she had been working 3 jobs, she had been too exhausted and too worried about debt to socialize. Now, she joined the ladies' sewing circle, helped organize church socials, and made real friends. Mrs. Henderson became a regular visitor, delighted to see Adelaide so happy. "I knew that young man was special," she would say. "Didn't I tell you he had good eyes?" One afternoon, about 3 months after the wedding, Adelaide was working in her garden when she felt a wave of nausea. She barely made it behind the house before she was sick. The nausea returned the next morning and the morning after that. Realization dawned slowly, then all at once. She was pregnant. Adelaide sat in the garden, her hand on her still flat stomach, and felt a complicated mix of emotions. Joy, certainly, but also fear. She had been pregnant once before, early in her marriage to Thomas, but had lost the baby at 3 months. The grief had been devastating, made worse by Thomas's indifference. She told Arthur that evening, watching his face carefully for his reaction. His expression cycled through surprise, joy, and then concern when he saw her own worried face. "What's wrong? Are you not happy about it?" "I am," Adelaide said quickly. "I'm just scared. I lost a baby before, and I don't know if I could survive that again." Arthur pulled her close. "If something happens, God forbid, we'll face it together. But let's not borrow trouble. Right now, in this moment, you're carrying our child. That's a miracle." His certainty helped ease her fear. Over the following weeks, as her body changed and the pregnancy became undeniable, Adelaide allowed herself to hope. Arthur was attentive to the point of being overprotective. He didn't want her lifting anything heavy or overexerting herself. Adelaide had to remind him that pregnant women had been doing chores since the dawn of time, but she was secretly touched by his concern. When she made it past 3 months, then 4, then 5, Adelaide's joy became unbounded. She sewed tiny clothes and Arthur built a cradle with his own hands, working on it in the evenings with meticulous care. "Boy or girl?" Arthur asked one evening as he sanded the cradle smooth. "I don't know," Adelaide said. "What do you hope for?" "Healthy," Arthur said immediately. "That's all. Healthy baby, healthy wife. Everything else is just details." Adelaide loved him fiercely in that moment. She moved to where he sat and wrapped her arms around him from behind, her growing belly pressing against his back. "You're going to be a wonderful father." "I hope so," Arthur said softly. "I want to do right by you both." Winter came to Nebraska with its usual harsh intensity. Adelaide was grateful to be warm and safe in their little house, with a husband who made sure the firewood was always stocked and the pantry was always full. She thought about the previous winter, working herself to exhaustion, living in fear of the cold because she could barely afford heating, and the contrast was almost painful. "What are you thinking about?" Arthur asked one snowy evening as they sat by the fire, Adelaide's feet in his lap as he rubbed them gently. "How different this year is from last year," Adelaide said. "How much better. No regrets about marrying a strange cowboy on a moment's notice." "Not a single one," Adelaide said firmly. "You saved my life, Arthur. In every way a person can be saved." "You saved mine too," Arthur said. "I was so lonely before you, just drifting through life without any real purpose. You gave me a reason to build something, to stay somewhere, to care." His hand moved to her belly where their child grew. "You gave me a family." Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears. Happy tears. The baby came in early March of 1877, after a labor that lasted through the night and into the next day. The doctor attended, along with Mrs. Henderson and 2 other women from town who had experience with births. Arthur paced outside for most of it, but when Adelaide cried out for him during a particularly difficult contraction, he came in and took her hand, staying for the rest of the ordeal despite the other women's protests that it wasn't proper. "I don't care about proper," Arthur said firmly, wiping Adelaide's face with a cool cloth. "My wife wants me here, so here I stay." When the baby finally came, a squalling, red-faced, perfect little boy, Arthur cut the cord with hands that shook. The doctor placed the baby in Adelaide's arms, and she looked down at her son with overwhelming love. "He's beautiful," she whispered. "He's perfect," Arthur agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "What should we name him?" Adelaide looked up at her husband, this man who had appeared in her life like a miracle when she needed one most. "I want to name him after you. Arthur Jr." "Are you sure?" Arthur asked, clearly moved. "I'm sure. He's named for the best man I know." Little Arthur was a good baby, or as good as any baby could be. He cried and needed feeding at all hours, and Adelaide was exhausted in a completely different way than she had been before. But this exhaustion came with joy, with purpose, with love. Arthur was a devoted father. He would walk the floor with the baby in the middle of the night, singing soft lullabies in his rough cowboy's voice. He would change diapers without complaint and make silly faces to coax smiles from his son. "I never knew I could feel like this," Arthur said one night as he held his sleeping son. "Like my heart is too big for my chest." Adelaide understood exactly what he meant. Their little family was everything she had never known she wanted. As Arthur Jr. grew from infant to toddler, Adelaide and Arthur's love for each other only deepened. They had built their marriage on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine care, and that foundation held strong through the challenges of parenthood, through occasional disagreements, through lean times and prosperous times. When Arthur Jr. was 2 years old, Adelaide discovered she was pregnant again. This time there was no fear, only joy. Their daughter was born in the autumn, a tiny thing with her mother's dark hair and her father's blue eyes. They named her Amelia. "2 children," Arthur said, holding his daughter while his son climbed on his back. "I'm the luckiest man alive." "We're all lucky," Adelaide corrected. She thought about that morning years ago when Arthur had walked into the saloon with his impossible offer. She had thought he was insane. Maybe he had been, a little, but it was the best kind of insanity. The years passed with the sweet rhythm of family life. Arthur continued as foreman at the Morrison Ranch, respected by the hands he supervised and valued by the Morrison family. Adelaide raised their children and kept their home, but it never felt like drudgery the way her work before had. This work was done for love, not desperation. Little Arthur grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved horses and books in equal measure. Amelia was spirited and fearless, always into something. When she was 3, Adelaide found her perched on the barn roof, having climbed up to see the world better. Arthur had to coax her down while Adelaide's heart pounded with terror and exasperation. "She gets that from you," Arthur said later, though he was trying not to laugh. "From me. I'm not the one who climbs on barn roofs." "No, but you're the one who took a wild chance on a strange cowboy. That takes courage. Amelia just expresses hers differently." Adelaide had to concede the point. When Arthur Jr. was 6 and Amelia was 4, Adelaide found herself pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the previous 2. She was older now, nearly 32, and she felt every day of it. But Arthur was endlessly patient, taking on more of the household duties, enlisting the children to help in small ways. Their 3rd child, another boy they named Andrew, was born in the summer. He was a calm baby, content to observe the world around him with solemn eyes. 3 children, Arthur marveled. "Our family is complete." Adelaide, holding Andrew while her other 2 children clamored for their father's attention, felt a contentment so profound it was almost frightening. She had been so close to losing everything. If Arthur hadn't walked into that saloon with his extraordinary offer, where would she be now? Would she have survived the crushing weight of those 3 jobs and all that debt? "What are you thinking?" Arthur asked, reading her expression the way he had learned to over their years together. "I'm thinking about how you told me my only job would be being loved," Adelaide said softly, "and how you kept that promise." Arthur reached over and squeezed her hand, careful not to disturb the baby. "It wasn't a hard promise to keep. Loving you is the easiest thing I've ever done." Time continued its march forward. The children grew. Little Arthur started school and proved to be an excellent student. Amelia remained wild and joyful, bringing chaos and laughter wherever she went. Andrew grew into a sweet, gentle child who loved animals and could calm even the most skittish horse. Fort Kearney continued to grow and change around them. The railroad expanded, bringing more people and more opportunities. The town added a proper school building, a new church, even a small library. Adelaide and Arthur watched these changes while their own lives remained happily stable. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Arthur took Adelaide into town for dinner at the hotel restaurant, a rare luxury. Mrs. Henderson watched the children, shooing them out the door with instructions to enjoy themselves. Over steak and potatoes, Arthur pulled out a small box. Inside was a delicate necklace with a small pendant. "Arthur, you didn't have to," Adelaide protested, even as she admired it. "I wanted to," Arthur said. 10 years ago I made you a promise. I promised to pay your debts and love you. I've done both, but I wanted to give you something that was just for you. Not practical, not necessary, just beautiful. Like you." Adelaide's eyes filled with tears as Arthur fastened the necklace around her throat. "I love you so much. I love you too, more with every passing day." They walked home slowly, hand in hand under the Nebraska stars. It was a far cry from that first rushed day when they had married as strangers. Now they were partners in every sense, bound by years of shared life and unshakable love. When they reached their house, now expanded with an additional room they had added as the children grew, they could hear laughter from inside. Through the window, they could see Mrs. Henderson reading to the children, all three of them enraptured by whatever story she was telling. "We built something good," Arthur said, his arm around Adelaide's waist. "We did," Adelaide agreed. "Against all odds, we really did." They went inside to their children, to their life, to the love that had started with an impossible offer and grown into something neither of them could have imagined. Years continued to pass in the way they do for happy families, each day much like the last but precious in its own right. The children grew and changed, testing boundaries and finding their own paths. Arthur Jr., true to his serious nature, declared at age 10 that he wanted to be a lawyer. Adelaide and Arthur scraped together money for extra books, encouraging his dreams. Amelia announced at age 8 that she was going to be a doctor, never mind that female doctors were rare. "You married Mama when you barely knew her," she told her father with perfect logic. "So anything is possible." Arthur had no argument for that. Andrew, the youngest, was content to follow his father around the ranch when Arthur would take him on Sundays. He had a gift with horses that even the experienced ranch hands marveled at. "That boy could calm a tornado," one old cowboy remarked after watching Andrew soothe a spooked mare. Adelaide watched her children become people with their own dreams and personalities, and she marveled at how different her life had turned out from what she had expected. If someone had told her on that exhausted morning at the saloon that she would end up here, happy and loved with 3 thriving children, she would have thought them cruel for offering false hope. But it hadn't been false. It had been real, all of it, built on a foundation of one man's loneliness and generosity, and one woman's desperate courage. One evening, when the children were settled in bed and Adelaide and Arthur sat on their porch as they often did, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Arthur turned to her with unusual seriousness. "I've been thinking," he said, "about expanding our house again. Maybe adding a proper parlor, updating the kitchen." "That sounds expensive," Adelaide said cautiously. Money was never as tight as it had been in those dark days before Arthur, but they were careful nonetheless. "I've been saving," Arthur said, "and I had an idea. I'm thinking of buying some land, starting a small ranch of our own. Nothing huge, just enough to run some cattle, maybe breed horses for Andrew since he loves them so much. I've learned a lot working for the Morrisons all these years. It's time to build something that's truly ours." Adelaide considered this. It would be a risk, but a calculated one. Arthur knew ranching inside and out, and the idea of having their own land, their own business to pass to their children was appealing. "What do you think?" Arthur asked. "It's a big decision." "I won't do it if you're not comfortable." Adelaide smiled, thinking about the much bigger risk they had both taken years ago when they married as strangers. "I think it's a wonderful idea. We've never been afraid of taking chances." Arthur grinned and pulled her close. "That's my girl." They spent the next year making plans and saving money. Arthur continued his work as foreman but began looking at available land. Adelaide took on sewing work from home, making clothes for other families in town, adding to their nest egg. The children, understanding that something exciting was happening, contributed in their own ways. Arthur Jr. helped his mother with her sewing business, managing the books with surprising skill for his age. Amelia took over more household chores without being asked. Andrew spent extra time at the Morrison Ranch, learning everything he could about horse care. When they finally found the right property, 20 acres with good grazing land and a water source, the whole family went to see it. It was north of Fort Kearny, about 5 miles out, close enough to town but far enough to have room to grow. "What do you think, kids?" Arthur asked as they stood on a small rise, looking over land that could be theirs. "It's perfect, Papa," Amelia said, her eyes shining. "Can we really build a ranch here?" Andrew asked, his voice full of hope. "We can," Arthur said. "It'll be hard work and we'll all have to pitch in, but yes, we can build something here." Arthur Jr., always the practical one, asked, "What will we call it?" Adelaide and Arthur looked at each other. They had discussed this, had turned it over in their minds during late-night planning sessions. "The Second Chance Ranch," Adelaide said, "because that's what this family is built on. Second chances." It was perfect. Buying the land and beginning to build the ranch required nearly every penny they had saved, plus a small loan from the bank that made Adelaide's stomach clench with old memories. But this time was different. This debt was an investment in their future, not the result of failed schemes. And this time, she had Arthur beside her, a true partner who discussed every decision with her. They kept their house in town at first, with Arthur and the older children riding out to the ranch land on weekends and whenever they could spare time. Slowly they built a barn, then corrals, then a bunkhouse. Arthur hired 2 ranch hands, young men eager to learn the trade. After 2 years of work, the ranch was operational. They had a small herd of cattle and had begun breeding horses. The house on the ranch was finished, larger than their townhouse and built to last. Moving day was bittersweet. Adelaide looked at the little house in Fort Kearny, the first real home she had known in years, the place where her children had been born, and felt tears sting her eyes. "We'll keep it," Arthur said, understanding her emotion. "Rent it out, but keep it. It's where we started. That matters." They settled into ranch life with varying degrees of adjustment. Arthur took to it like he was born for it, which in many ways he had been. Andrew was in heaven, finally able to work with horses every day. Amelia loved the freedom of the open land, racing her horse across the plains with her hair streaming behind her. Arthur Jr. struggled more with the isolation, missing the town and his friends and his books. Adelaide made sure they went into Fort Kearny regularly so he could visit the library and spend time with other children his age. "You don't have to be a rancher just because your father is," Adelaide told him one evening, when she found him looking wistfully at his law books. "But the ranch is our family business now," Arthur Jr. said. "Shouldn't I help?" "You do help, and we appreciate it. But your father and I want you to follow your own dreams. If that's the law, then that's what you should pursue." Arthur Jr. hugged her tightly. "Thanks, Mama." When Arthur Jr. turned 16, they sent him to live in town with Mrs. Henderson, who was delighted to have him, so he could attend the better school and prepare for college. It was hard to see him go, but it was the right thing. Amelia declared she would do the same when her time came, preparing to pursue medicine. Adelaide had no doubt she would make it happen through sheer force of will. Andrew, though, was a rancher through and through. At 14, he could handle any horse on the place, and was already making suggestions for improving their breeding program that Arthur implemented with pride. The ranch prospered. Word spread about the quality of the horses they bred, and buyers came from as far as Colorado and Kansas. The cattle herd grew steadily. They hired more hands. What had started as a dream became a thriving business. One evening, nearly 18 years after that fateful morning in the saloon, Adelaide and Arthur sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching Andrew work with a young colt in the corral. "Do you ever think about how unlikely all of this was?" Adelaide asked. That day you walked into the saloon and proposed to a stranger. I think about it all the time, Arthur said. Best decision I ever made, even if it was crazy. What made you do it? Adelaide asked. She had never really pressed him on this before. Why me, really? Arthur was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. I'd been watching you for a couple of weeks before I finally worked up the courage to say something. Every time I saw you, you were running from one job to another, dead on your feet but still going. And I saw something in your eyes. Pain, yeah, and exhaustion, but also determination. You weren't giving up, even when anyone else would have. He took her hand, his thumb rubbing over her knuckles in a familiar gesture. I'd been alone for so long, Adelaide. After my family died, I was just going through the motions. I worked and drifted and worked some more, but I wasn't living. When I saw you, I saw someone who was fighting to live despite everything. And I thought, if I could help you, if we could help each other, maybe we could both actually start living again. And did we? Adelaide asked softly. Look around, Arthur said, gesturing at the ranch, at their son working in the corral, at the home they had built together. What do you think? Adelaide leaned her head on his shoulder. I think we did more than survive. We thrived. Because of you, Arthur said. You took a chance on me. You could have said no. You could have kept struggling on your own, but you were brave enough to accept help, brave enough to try something new. We were both brave, Adelaide corrected. You were brave enough to offer in the first place. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the Nebraska sky in brilliant colors. Their life wasn't perfect. They had challenges, moments of hardship, times when money was tight or the weather was harsh or the children were difficult. But it was a good life, built on love and partnership and mutual respect. Arthur Jr. went to college back east, funded by the ranch and his parents' sacrifices. He wrote home regularly, his letters full of enthusiasm for his studies. Amelia followed a few years later, heading to a women's college that had a reputation for supporting female medical students. Andrew stayed on the ranch, becoming his father's true partner in running the operation. As Adelaide entered her 40s and then her 50s, she watched her children become adults with satisfaction and pride. Arthur Jr. became a lawyer, eventually returning to Nebraska to practice in Omaha. He married a kind woman named Sarah, and they gave Adelaide and Arthur their first grandchildren. Amelia became a doctor against all odds, fighting prejudice and skepticism with the same fierce determination she had shown as a child climbing barn roofs. She set up a practice in Denver, serving populations that other doctors ignored. Andrew married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread, a practical woman named Margaret who loved the land as much as he did. They took over more and more of the ranch operations as Arthur gradually stepped back. Adelaide and Arthur, now in their 60s, spent their days in the ranch house, still working but at a slower pace. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching their grandchildren play and marvel at the life they had built. Your only job is being loved, Arthur said one evening, echoing his words from so long ago. I think I've done all right with that. Adelaide laughed, the sound rich and warm. All right, Arthur Nolan, you've exceeded all expectations. Right back at you, Adelaide Nolan. They continued sitting as the stars came out one by one, lighting up the vast Nebraska sky. The Second Chance Ranch hummed with life around them, a testament to what could be built on a foundation of courage and love. Adelaide thought about the woman she had been, exhausted and desperate, working 3 jobs just to survive. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime. Arthur had offered her a way out, but more than that, he had offered her a way forward. And together, they had created something neither of them could have built alone. It wasn't just a ranch they had built. It was a family, a legacy, a life filled with meaning and love. It was everything Adelaide had stopped believing was possible during those dark months of widowhood and debt. One particularly beautiful summer evening, when they were both in their late 60s, Adelaide and Arthur sat on their porch watching the sunset as they had done countless times before. Andrew and Margaret's children, 3 of them now, were playing in the yard while their parents finished the day's work in the barn. "I've been thinking," Arthur said. "Dangerous, I know." Adelaide smiled. "What about that day in the saloon? About the promise I made you?" "I said your only job would be being loved." He turned to look at her, his blue eyes still as clear and honest as they had been when he was a young man. "But that wasn't quite right, was it? It wasn't a job at all. It was my privilege, my joy." Adelaide felt her throat tighten with emotion. Even after all these years, he could still make her feel cherished. "It went both ways, you know. You gave me so much, but I hope I gave you something too." "You gave me everything," Arthur said simply. "A home, a family, a purpose. You gave me back my life, Adelaide. I was just existing before you, going through the motions. You made me want to really live again." They held hands as the sun completed its descent, the sky turning from gold to purple to deep blue. Around them, the ranch they had built together, the life they had created, the family they had raised, everything was solid and real and good. Their grandchildren's laughter rang out across the yard. Andrew emerged from the barn, waving up at them. Margaret came out of the house with lemonade for the children. It was an ordinary evening, nothing special, and yet it was everything. This was what Arthur had promised her all those years ago, though neither of them had known exactly what form it would take. Not just being loved, but having a life worth living. Being part of something larger than herself. Having security and support and partnership. Having a family not born of desperation or duty, but of genuine affection and respect. "No regrets?" Arthur asked softly. Adelaide squeezed his hand. "Not a single one. You. Only that I didn't walk into that saloon sooner," Arthur said. "I would have liked more years with you, though I'm grateful for everyone we've had." "We still have time," Adelaide said. "Plenty of time." And they did. They had several more good years, watching their grandchildren grow, seeing their children succeed in their various pursuits, managing the ranch alongside Andrew and Margaret. They took pleasure in simple things: morning coffee together, evening walks, the changing seasons on the Nebraska plains, each other's constant companionship. When Arthur finally passed at the age of 73, quickly and quietly in his sleep one winter night, Adelaide grieved deeply but not desperately. She had loved him with her whole heart, and she had been loved the same way in return. That kind of love didn't end with death. It continued in the family they had built, the legacy they had left, the example they had set. She lived several more years after Arthur, surrounded by children and grandchildren who made sure she was never alone unless she chose to be. She spent her days reading poetry, working in her garden, telling stories about the early days of the ranch to grandchildren who hung on every word. When her time came, Adelaide slipped away peacefully at the age of 76, in the ranch house she and Arthur had built together. Her children were with her, and as she drew her last breath, she was smiling. They buried her next to Arthur on a hill overlooking the ranch, exactly as she had requested. The headstone was simple but perfect. Adelaide Nolan, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She took a chance on love, and love rewarded her. The Second Chance Ranch continued to thrive under Andrew's management, eventually passing to his children and then to their children. The story of how it all began became family legend. How Arthur Nolan, a lonely cowboy, walked into a saloon and offered a desperate widow an impossible lifeline. How Adelaide Donovan took a wild chance on a stranger. How they built an entire life, an entire legacy, on a foundation of courage and kindness. Future generations of Nolans would sit on that same porch, watching sunsets over the Nebraska plains, and talk about their ancestors who had started it all. They would tell the story to their own children, emphasizing the important parts. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is accept help. That love can appear in the most unexpected ways. That a single moment of courage can change everything. The little house in Fort Kearny, the one where Adelaide and Arthur had first lived as newlyweds, remained in the family for generations. It was maintained carefully, almost reverently, a reminder of where everything began. The saloon where Arthur had first made his offer eventually closed, but the building still stood, repurposed over the years but never torn down. Fort Kearny itself evolved with time, growing from a frontier town into a proper city, but it never lost its connection to its past. The story of the Nolans became part of the town's history, a favorite tale told to tourists and new residents. The widow who worked 3 jobs and the lonely cowboy who told her the only job she needed was being loved. It had the ring of fairy tale, but it was absolutely true. Years turned to decades, decades to a century. The ranch endured through depressions and wars, through changes in technology and society. But the core of what Arthur and Adelaide had built, the emphasis on family and hard work and genuine love, remained unchanged. In the ranch house, in a place of honor, hung a frame containing 2 things: a faded newspaper clipping about the marriage of Arthur Nolan and Adelaide Donovan in 1876, and a piece of paper with Arthur's careful handwriting. "Your only job is being loved." It was a promise that had been kept faithfully for all the years they had together. It was a promise that echoed through generations. It was a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary lives begin with a single moment of extraordinary courage. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blew just right across the Nebraska plains, you could almost hear it. The echo of laughter from that first modest house in town, the sound of children playing in the yard of the ranch, the soft murmur of 2 voices on a porch, talking about everything and nothing, perfectly content in each other's company. The widow had worked 3 jobs, barely surviving. The lonely cowboy had said her only job would be being loved. And together, they had built something that lasted far beyond their own lives, a testament to the power of taking chances on love, on faith, on each other. The ending was not a conclusion, but a continuation. Their love story living on in every generation that came after, in every sunset over the Second Chance Ranch, in every retelling of how it all began with an impossible offer and a desperate widow brave enough to say yes.